All right, so today I'm going to be talking about the ancestral villages of the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe. The S'Klallam historically were spread out, as I said, over a range of roughly 4,000 square miles, with over 24 villages that were spread across the north coast of the Olympic Peninsula. You can see a cluster of villages over there on the south tip of Vancouver Island, and then a couple villages going down into Admiralty Inlet till you get down to Nukes Quite, where Port Gamble is today. And the S'Klallam would go down seasonally every year down into Hood Canal, where they would fish for salmon on the Quilcene, Dosewallips, Duckabush, and Hamahama rivers, and then come back to the winter villages, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. And the villages that we're going to be talking about are these cluster of villages around the mouth of the Dungeness River. So on this map, the village names you can see are actually the ones highlighted in red. The names in white are names of different geographic features like prairies, wetlands, spits, that sort of thing. But we're going to be talking about primarily 5 villages today. Tsatsich, which is where Kleinspit County Park is today. Tseskat, which is on a bluff overlooking the mouth of the Dungeness River. The village of St'Tithlam, which was to the east of the mouth of the Dungeness River. The historic settlement of Jamestown itself, and then Shchequing, which was the village at the mouth of Squim Bay, where Battelle Marine Science Laboratory sits today. So this is one of the earliest maps, historic maps that we have showing some of these village sites, and you can see that I've highlighted 2 of them. It's misidentified as a Classet village. Classet was a term that early European explorers used for what they perceived to be the cultural grouping that included the Makah, the Nitnat way out on the west coast, and then groups all the way into the Straits. We now know that those were many different tribes speaking different languages, but when the first ships came in, those people all wore the same kind of clothing generally and looked very similar, and so the Europeans presumed they were all the same people and called them all Classets. So that's what that name is. And then you can see, it's kind of hard to see in the other image, but a potlatch house from the Shchequing village is on the map. So I talked about the village of St'Tithlam. You may be familiar with the name Cheechmahan or Chief Chetzemoka, who's the famous historic chief of the S'Klallam. The many families in the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe today trace their ancestry through Chief St'Tithlam, who is a historic chief around the late 1700s. There was an older St'Tithlam, then he had a son, St'Tithlam the younger, who married the princess of Nanaimo, and they had the famous 7 sons of St'Tithlam and Yawitsa, the little sister. Lacanum was one of those 7 sons. Lacanum was the chief after St'Tithlam. Then his oldest son, Closton, who was called by the Europeans King George because they couldn't pronounce his S'Klallam name, he became the chief. Closton was only the chief for a few years, and then he abdicated in favor of his younger brother, Cheechmahan, or Chief Chetzemoka. So when you look on this map, when you see the village identified as King George's Lodges, it wasn't King George from England, it was Closton, the S'Klallam chief, who was the older brother of Chief Cheechmahan. When Chief Cheechmahan became chief of the S'Klallam people, he moved his village and sort of the capital of the S'Klallam, if you will, to Katai at Port Townsend. And that's why when you read the Treaty of 1855, Katai is listed as sort of the capital of the S'Klallam, even though there really was no such thing. And there was a substantial S'Klallam presence at Katai led by Chief Cheechmahan. Those were folks who came primarily from that village of St'Tithlam. Oh, and the other village that we're going to talk about, Tseskat, you can see is located just to the west of King George's Lodges, right there around the mouth of the Dungeness River. So this timeline sort of breaks down. You can see where they've had trouble pronouncing the name of the village over time. Tetlam was one attempt, and Stetlam, and Curtis was pretty close with St'Tithlam. There were still 2 very large houses there in 1859, but you can see at that point the population decline at that village site had already started, and by 1855, in the treaty era, a large number of those families again moved over to Katai or to the village of Tseskat. And this also corresponded with a shift in the mouth of the Dungeness River from what's now the Meadowbrook Creek channel. The Dungeness River used to flow through that channel, and around 1850 shifted to its current channel, where it breaks through a ridge where the old Dungeness schoolhouse is. So, that shifting of resources also would have caused a shifting in where the S'Klallam were living at that time. So this image from Paul Kane gives you a really good idea what the inside of those great lodges would have looked like, what those potlatch houses would have looked like. You can see inside there's different apartments broken out with partitions, and those are for individual nuclear families. Within one large longhouse, you would actually have an extended family with grandma, grandpa, aunts, uncles, cousins. You could have up to 30 or more people living. Some of these longhouses were massive, hundreds of feet long. You can see that there's platforms up around the roof for holding food and hides and other goods. There's also little platforms around those partitioned apartments, those little benches. You can see the person laying down, that was where you slept, and then in the day it was sort of a bench that you sat on. Each one of these little areas had its own cooking hearth, and you can see the holes in the roof over where those cooking hearths were that would let the smoke out of the building. The little white dogs that you can see, those are probably wool dogs. So the S'Klallam and some other Coast Salish tribes actually raised a specific breed of dog from which the women would harvest wool. And it wasn't fur, it was very much wool, the same qualities that sheep's wool has, and wove these beautiful blankets with it. Unfortunately, with the introduction of sheep's wool, that being a very cheap commodity that was easier to acquire than raising these dogs, the dogs were allowed to interbreed with sort of the other mongrel dogs that were running around the villages, and the breed has disappeared. But there are a few of those blankets still out there in museum collections. So next I want to talk about S'Klallam, shifting over to the other side of the Dungeness River. And this was a very, very large S'Klallam village site. And what happened was, as you had non-natives arrive starting in the 1850s, farmers begin settling on these prairie sites that you can see highlighted with the red polygons, the red circles. So those were the Squim prairies. Those were the first places that the British and American settlers came in and tried to farm. That was where the S'Klallam women had their camas gardens that they would return to traditionally every year to harvest camas. And actually by this time, the women actually had potato patches out on those prairies as well. So potatoes were introduced by the Spanish out at Nia Bay, and they were also traded through Fort Vancouver up to Fort Nisqually. So the Coast Salish tribes acquired potatoes sometime around probably the 1830s, 1840s, maybe a little bit earlier. Potato agriculture is essentially the same as camas agriculture. You use the same methods to grow both of them. So it took on very quickly, and potatoes a very calorie-rich, carb-rich food. So it became a very important food source. So very early on, you had a source of conflict between the S'Klallam people and the first farmers who were arriving and settling on these potato patches, because they would build their cabins, start their farm, and then a couple months later, the tribe would show up and start digging up all of the potatoes and everything, and what the farmer saw as their farm, but what had been traditionally harvested by the tribes for thousands of years. This village actually grew as the non-native settlements grew here on the interior Salish Sea. The settlement here at Dungeness was actually originally called Whiskey Flats because it was primarily a source for bootlegging liquor and shipping that into the U.S. to the tribes on this side of the border from Britain, on the other side of the border, Canada. Many smaller villages to the east along the straits, going way out to S'Klallam Bay, the Hoko River, Pish. There were a lot of smaller villages out there where those folks started to pick up and move east to Katai, to Dungeness, to S'Klallam, to these village sites, because there was increased economic opportunity in these growing settlements. One of the big ways that the S'Klallam made money was to actually transport farmers' goods in their canoes over to Victoria. And that was actually the reason why the Dungeness non-native settlement shifted from up there on the bluff overlooking Klein Spit to east of the Dungeness River was Dungeness Bay itself silted up. They couldn't get ships in to ship out their farming goods from the Sequim Dungeness Valley, so they moved the entire town site over. But the farmers around the old area still used the tribal folks living at Tsatsich, the small village on Klein Spit, to ship their goods over to Victoria, to Port Townsend, and to Seattle, and these other small cities that were then growing. So by 1855, the S'Klallam, Tawana, and Chimacum signed the Treaty of Point No Point. The federal government tried to make the S'Klallam move to the Skokomish Reservation, down at the head of Hood Canal at the mouth of the Skokomish River. It's essentially, it's still, for the most part today, is a very swampy, wetland-rich area. At that time, it was just a massive marsh. So not only was it not culturally and socially identifiable as S'Klallam land, it wasn't, you couldn't live on it. It was literally marsh. So also, with the signing of the treaty, the S'Klallam people reserve the right to hunt and fish in their usual and accustomed territories. There's no way to hunt and fish in your usual and accustomed territories if you're 120 miles away down at Skokomish. You know, there's no way that you can do that back and forth. So the S'Klallam never left, and that's what I'll talk about here in a couple slides of how they came to be at the Jamestown Village site. But so as you see through these points, the situation sort of deteriorated as the non-Indian population grew. There was more and more conflict between the two. There were a couple guys who kept selling liquor to the tribe, even though it was illegal to do so. And if you read the accounts of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, it's basically a litany of complaints and despair at the inability of the federal government to uphold their treaty obligations and provide they were actually supposed to provide a hospital, health care, and all of these other support systems that would have helped the tribe break off from, you know, these less desirable systems that were associated with folks who were actually over in Victoria and on the Canadian side, and especially over in the San Juan Islands. The San Juan Islands were kind of a free-for-all for about 50 years during the British-U.S. War, trying to decide where the line was. So there were a lot of moonshiners up there and bootleggers who would then transport their goods into U.S. waters. So this is a close-up from a map showing the village. So you can see it was actually a couple of very large longhouses connected to each other. And by the late 1860s, a group of the non-native settlers from the Dungeness settlement wrote a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs asking him to remove the S'Klallam from this village. The S'Klallam knew that was happening, so they went ahead and they found a guy, Joe Delante, who was logging about 200 acres a few miles to the east. He agreed to sell them that land in exchange for keeping his right-of-way to take his timber off of the land, and that's actually what became the Jamestown settlement. These the images you can see in the middle are actually artifacts that were collected from this village site back in 1908 by Harlan Smith, who was traveling through the area and identifying old village sites. You can see it's a bone awl, bone points, antler wedges, and these are pretty typical artifacts for what we find at Coast Salish and S'Klallam village sites in this area. So Tsatsich, I mentioned this village earlier. It was never a very big village, just a few homes, a few families, primarily made their living off of shellfish. Dungeness Bay was incredibly rich shellfish bay. And actually, when Harlan Smith, that archaeologist, visited the site, there was a shell heap there that was over 3 meters thick. So at least 10, 11 feet high. That's a lot of clam and oyster shells, and that's from people living there for a very, very long time. You eat your shellfish, and then you would deposit it around the outside of the house. It eventually creates these mounds that we call shell middens. And that's sort of what you see him describing here. In 1907, you could still see the rectangular depressions within those shell mounds that were the old homes. The wood rots away, and you're left with a rectangular square of shell. And again, both of these villages closely associated with this prairie, I can't pronounce that, Stultulcum prairie, which is in English called Long Prairie now, which you can see stretched almost the entire south shore of Dungeness Bay, and was incredibly productive for fern roots, which the tribe would gather. The women would pound those up and actually into a type of very starch-rich flour, which was used to bake a type of bread. So I mentioned the shifting of the Dungeness River, and you can see here actually in the map on the left side, so that 1855 channel is highlighted in yellow. Prior to that, so say 1840, the Dungeness River was running through the Meadowbrook Creek Dungeness River Paleo Channel, which if you look at the map on the right side, you can see that Meadowbrook Creek channel actually went around the edge of that QGD, that's our glacial till, a ridge of our glacial till that comes down, and that's actually what that old Dungeness schoolhouse is sitting directly on. And the bridge that goes over the Dungeness River connects one side of that ridge to the other. The river broke through that ridge in about 1855. And so, you know, when I talk about all of the anthropogenic factors that cause the shifting in populations and where the S'Klallam were moving and living at times, there were also natural factors at play, especially, for example, the shifting of the river, which then causes families to shift where their fish camps are, and that, you know, how far you want to walk every day to your fish camp, etc. So this is a great example. We have very detailed accounts of Jamestown S'Klallam ancestors having their fish traps on the Dungeness River right around where that old schoolhouse is today, because it's that natural choke point. So the river funnels down to a very narrow area, and so there were a series of at least 4 or 5, probably more than that, fish traps spaced a couple hundred yards apart, going up and down the river from there, and specific families would own rights to specific fish traps, and then when they weren't using those fish traps, they would let other families harvest out of them. S'Klallam was the village I mentioned earlier at the mouth of Squim Bay. If you're familiar with Battelle Marine Science Laboratories, they're located directly on top of this old village site. So we currently curate thousands of artifacts from this site that were excavated by archaeologists during that construction of the Battelle Laboratories. And in recent years, we've done more surveying out there. This wasn't as large of a village as S'Klallam, but it was still quite a large village. You can see in 1839, the population was still around 150 people. Historically, there would have been probably about 40 or 50 slaves at this village as well. Slavery was something that by the 1830s, 1840s was already starting to slow down amongst the Coast Salish. And actually, with the signing of Treaty of 1855, slavery was forbidden amongst the S'Klallam and Coast Salish tribes, even though it took the U.S. another 10 years to get to that point. So, interesting historical note. On this map, you can see I've actually highlighted the village structure in red, and I'm going to show you an image of what it really looked like. But from this map, it appears, oh, it's just one building or it's just one house. But what you're looking at in reality is 10 houses that are actually connected to each other, that sort of becomes this one massive superstructure. And this is the traditional way that Pacific Northwest coastal villages were built. So a lot of times when you look on the maps, all you're going to see is 1, 2, maybe 3 structures, when in reality you're looking at maybe a couple dozen homes that are all connected to each other. What's really cool about S'Klallam is we have an account that tribal ancestors gave to ethnographer and anthropologist Erna Gunther back in the 1920s from their memories of that village in the 1880s, essentially before it disappeared, of who lived in what houses. So now we're able to go back out to that village site with tribal families and point out, okay, well, here's the house where your great-great-great-great-grandparents live, which is just a really cool experience. These descriptions that they're giving, you know, again, this is in 1880, so this is post at least 3 epidemics. This is, by this point, the village population was around 30 to 40 people. So when you read through these accounts, each one of these homes basically has one nuclear family in it, when in reality each of these homes has 4, 6 hearths in it and was originally meant to house 20 to 30 people, but due to the impacts of epidemics and disease and population loss, what they were describing was sort of the last gasp of this village in 1880, before it disappeared. The last chief died in 1885. Nobody stepped into that role. Hans Buggy bought the property and turned it into a clam cannery. Tribal folks continued to live out at the clam cannery site through the 1950s and 60s. There was a small village out on Travis Spit across from the cannery, which is what this image is showing. And we have tribal elders who lived in these structures. When Battelle purchased the property in the 1960s, basically right after these photos were taken, the structures were condemned and burned down. But we went back out, I guess it was 2 years ago. I went out with archaeologists from the Department of Energy, Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. We surveyed the spit and essentially documented where these old home sites are, and they're now protected archaeological sites. These are some of the artifacts from that site. So on the left side, you can see a hand maul that would have been used for pounding the elk antler wedge in the bottom middle into cedar. Cedar splits straight down the grain, which is why one of the reasons why it was so important to the Coast Salish. You can use that elk antler wedge and split nice straight cedar planks to use for building your longhouse, or you can carve a canoe. You can see we've got some different toggled harpoon points, and an etched pebble similar to the ones that they found at the Chewitson village site over in Port Angeles. So if you remember the excavations there at the graving yard, and they ended up excavating a S'Klallam cemetery there, they found over 300 etched pebbles. These are actually the first etched pebbles that we found at another site on this side of the U.S. border. So again, showing the cultural connections between 2 S'Klallam villages on the north coast of the Olympic Peninsula, and then we find etched pebbles on Vancouver Island all the way up through the Alaskan archipelago and into southern Alaska. So cultural connections connecting all the way up through that area. Very cool. So for all of the reasons that I mentioned previously, in 1874, 17 S'Klallam families got together. They pulled together $500 in gold coin, which they purchased 210 acres. Those lots were then apportioned by how much each family contributed. And you can see that they were all done in these long perpendicular lots, which you can still see if you look at it on a county map or Google Aerial today. And that's because each family needed beach frontage to pull up their canoe, to continue their traditional fishing and subsistence living. So you can see the properties all the way over at the far right. Property A, that was the one owned by James Balch, the largest. He contributed the largest amount of money. If you go down to Jamestown today, you'll see at the very northeast corner of Jamestown, James Balch's grave, and there's a small totem pole there next to there's a beach that's open to the public that's owned by Graysmarsh Farms. That entire property is now owned by Graysmarsh Farms, and they preserve that burial area for the tribe out of respect for the chief. So this is showing you a couple years later. I put in names of some of the different tribal folks who owned the lots. This is around the 1920s, 1930s. Ida Hall was Chief Balch's granddaughter. So you can see, these are basically the lots being passed down from those original purchasers to their descendants. Today, there's only a handful of lots still owned by Jamestown S'Klallam families. But they are still descended from those original families and holding on to those plots that their ancestors purchased in the 1870s. The image on the bottom right part of your screen, this image was taken in the 1920s, and many of the older folks in this photo are those original Jamestown settlers. We just found this photo in the back of a filing cabinet in our library about 6 months ago, and we're very, very excited about it because it's the first time that we've seen a photo of many of these individuals. So it was a great find. This is an image showing you one of the Indian Shaker Church processions, probably in the late 1800s, early 1900s, going down Jamestown Beach Road. You can see the small shacks along the beach where the men kept their crab shacks, and the canoes pulled up next to those. Today, the only crab shack that's left is Brick Johnson's famous little crab shack that has the crab painted on the back of it, but the beach originally had a couple of those along it. The Shaker Church essentially became the community center for the Jamestown Village from the late 1800s through the 1930s. There were huge Indian Shaker Church conventions that happened where folks from tribes all over the Salish Sea would show up. I believe this photo was from 1926, I want to say, but I could be wrong on that one. But just a really, really cool photo. Again, another photo looking Jamestown Beach, and you can see the crab shacks and then the church steeple in the distance.